you and the state comptroller, Thomas DiNapoli, got together recently and said you were going to jointly audit certain aspects of the MTA. And I think those aspects, if I remember my reading correctly, have to do with service disruptions. Tell us a little bit about that and why you're focusing on that.
Oh, there are few New Yorkers who can claim that they've never been affected by service disruptions. In fact, almost every line in the system has had consistent shutdowns, particularly on weekends and in the evening hours, late evening hours, early morning hours. You know, a lot of the immigrant community is not on a Monday to Friday schedule, and the only way people get to and from work is by subway. But when the MTA continues to shut down service on weekends for long extended periods and for so many years in a row, people just have a high level of skepticism that they are in fact working on the tracks every time and all the time that subway service is taken down.
Now, one of the big concerns, though, of New Yorkers are the combination of fare hikes on the one hand, and on the other hand, service reductions. We're going to cut this line, we're going to cut these many routes. What, in your view, is responsible for this cycle on the part of the MTA, and what can be done, especially in your role as controller? What can be done about that?
Well, the MTA is probably in its most difficult, the worst fiscal shape it's been in a long time. Part of that is its own fault, part of it is not. The MTA has suffered in this economic downturn. Certain kinds of real estate tax revenues are substantially down from what they used to be, and so that's not necessarily, that isn't the fault of the agency. But of course, there are other long-term financial management practices that they could have adopted that would have kind of lessened the impact of these up and down swings in the economy. And so without better management, the MTA will continue to keep asking people to pay more and keep threatening service reductions. The audit that Comptroller DiNapoli and I initiated is somewhat separate from that larger picture problem of the MTA, but it drills down a very specific problem. And that is that if the MTA cannot even manage the subway shutdowns closely with the actual work that's taking place on the tracks, the reason for which the subway shutdowns take place, then how can they tightly manage the overall system? So while we're not looking in this instance at the overall system and the overall management and the finances of the authority, we are looking at a very specific management flaw that affects so many people, particularly in the immigrant communities in New York City.
And now, the MTA, many feel, who go back far enough to remember when it was set up, was a very convenient tool for the mayors, the governors, because they could each, with some degree of truth, claim that, well, we don't control the MTA. I mean, this is a state agency, a hybrid state-city agency, and so as if the MTA operated in a political vacuum and wasn't a creature in some sense of both the state and the city government. And indeed, I think some would say that Mayor Bloomberg often talked about the MTA and the Transit Authority and the subway system and its problems and its fare hikes as if it was something he didn't have anything to do with. But he has at least 3 appointees, isn't it?
The mayor has 4 appointees on the MTA board.
Okay.
Yes.
So doesn't he bear some responsibility?
The mayor does have a fair amount of influence on the MTA. Not nearly as much as the governor, because it technically still is a state authority. I think that these public authorities, the most, if we can say infamous one of which is the MTA, they were set up more than 40 years ago in New York because there was a pure intent to try to take politics out of running some of these very difficult agencies to run, providing vital services and taking the politics out of the decision-making process. That may have worked 40 years ago. It's clearly not working now because there's lots of politics in play here. And the public has come to expect and also receive a much greater level of transparency from elected officials. There are all sorts of disclosures, but from the MTA, it's almost as if it's still stuck back 40 years ago when it didn't have to respond to even public criticism.
And in fact, weren't they caught with their hand in the cookie jar in the sense of they were keeping two separate sets of books, one set of books telling the public one story, another set of books more internally about what they really knew was going on?
That's exactly right. They had different sets of financials, one that they presented to the public to try to drum up support for their need for a historically high fare increase, and another set of books that they were using to justify high bond ratings.
Okay.
So that was one clear example where the MTA was presenting a different set of financial situations depending on the audience, even though it was for the same time period. I think they've improved somewhat, to give them just an ounce of credit, that they have put more information online and given the public a little bit more information, but they still have a long way to go in terms of giving people clear explanations. You know, in theory, all the information is there for the public to look at, but sometimes when the public has, or even elected officials have a question, it's almost like looking for a needle in a haystack.